She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them owned the land they stood on. Snow was falling, hard over the Montana plains, thick as silence and twice as cold. December had sunk its claws deep into the land, frosting brittle grass silver and clutching the wooden beams of Stone River Ranch like grief that refused to let go. Wind tore down from the high ridges, shrieking between outbuildings, rattling loose shingles, and stinging any skin foolish enough to show. May walked straight into it. Her coat was thin, patched at the elbows, threadbare enough that the cold gnawed straight through. Her gloves didn't match, one wool, one leather, but her spine stayed rigid, her eyes burning with the kind of fierce defiance only women with nothing left to lose could muster. A satchel knocked against her hip as she crossed the yard. Her boots bit sharp tracks into the frozen mud. She stopped in front of the cookhouse, where a knot of cowboys huddled close to an open fire. They passed a flask between them, laughter breaking in short bursts through chattering teeth. One by one, their laughter faltered when they noticed her. A woman alone, on a ranch that gave nothing freely. The tall one stepped forward. Older than the rest, his beard grayed, his brow carved deep with suspicion. His voice was gravel-soaked in whiskey. "This here's a working ranch, miss. Not a place for strays or stories." "I am not a stray," May replied, steady low. "And I ain't here to tell stories." He scanned her up and down, weighing every seam of her coat, every scar of hunger on her frame. "We don't got use for trouble, or liars, or girls who think they can sweet-talk their way outta the cold." May's jaw tightened. "I ain't here to sweet-talk neither." Another man stepped forward, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, with spit freezing on his lip. "She looks like she come from a saloon kitchen," he sneered. "If not the back room." That brought a ripple of low laughter. "Sharp. Ugly." The bearded man silenced them with a raised hand. He stepped closer, close enough that his breath steamed into hers. "Well, what do you want?" May didn't flinch. She met his stare. "I can cook. Cast iron over fire. Skinned game. Sourdough in snowstorms. Soup out of bones. I can feed your men with scraps from the barrel and make him say, 'Thank you,' after." The fire behind them cracked. The wind pressed against the cookhouse door. "Where you come from?" he asked. May said nothing. "This ain't a place for secrets," he pressed. She lifted her chin. "I know how to cook, and I ain't turning back." The man studied her, silence dragging. Then at last he stepped aside, nodding toward the cookhouse. "We got 3 dozen men through winter and no proper meals in 2 days. Stoves in there. You want the job? Prove it by morning." May didn't move, didn't blink. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel, and a little respect." "Wouldn't kill you." That tugged a rough laugh from his throat. "Well, we'll see about that last part." She brushed past him, heading for the cookhouse door. As she did, her gaze flicked across the fire-lit faces. Most looked away. A few smirked. Others scowled. But one man did not move. He leaned against a post, tall and still. A dark coat pulled close, brimmed hat shadowing his eyes. Only his jaw caught the firelight. A sharp line of stone, expression unreadable. He didn't mock her, didn't look away, just watched. For one heartbeat too long, May held his gaze. Then she pushed open the door. Inside, the air was colder than out. Grease soured in the corners, pots rusted black, tins scattered like bones. The stove loomed tall, iron-bellied in the corner. May let her satchel drop to the hook. She rolled up her sleeves. Stubborn hope surged. The man in the dark coat, Caleb, watched her go. He had known her face before she spoke. He'd seen her years ago in Billings, behind the kitchen doors of Rosebell, that painted-up place where men told lies and left their honor at the threshold. He remembered the night she was dragged into a back room, accused of stealing or maybe just standing too tall. A man twice her size had clamped a hand around her wrist. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She had stood there, spine straight, eyes like fire, daring him to break her. Caleb had watched then from the shadows, and he had done nothing. Now here she was again, snow in her hair, defiance in every step, and he knew a storm had arrived. outside and in, and it bore her name. The next morning, before the moon surrendered, May was already on her feet. The cold bit harder than teeth as she forced open the cookhouse door. Snow drifted against the frame. Her coat clung stiff with frost. Inside, she cracked ice from the barrel, fed pine kindling into the stove, and coaxed flame until the breath fog fled the air. Her fingers stung, her back ached, but she moved with the endurance of someone who had lived through worse, and had no intention of being broken now. 15 men, 15 mouths. She kneaded flour into stiff dough, sliced salted pork into thick ribbons, and fried them slow in iron. Biscuits came out hard-edged but hot. Coffee boiled black enough to raise the dead. The men muttered at first. One asked where the real cook was. Another laughed too loud and said she must have poisoned the beans. By the third morning, they came early to the benches. The cookhouse was never quiet. Not really. Pans clattered. Boots dragged mud across the floor. Laughter rose and fell like the hiss of fire. But May moved through it like still water. Her biscuits always came out golden. Her stew always thick. Her bread so warm it softened even the hardest mouths at the table. She passed the coffee pot like it was treasure, and though no one praised her out loud, every man at that table emptied his plate. She worked without fuss. Scrubbed pans herself, swept ashes into the corners, even scrubbed the floorboards when the fire died low. Order mattered. Clean mattered. It was how she kept herself steady. Caleb noticed. He was always the first one through the door, before the others dragged themselves in from the yard. He never said much, never needed to. He stacked logs into the firebox without being asked, set kindling just so, and slipped out again without ceremony. May would nod once. He'd tip his hat, just barely. Their exchange was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Caleb spoke freely with the others, sat shoulder to shoulder with them at meals. But with her, there was distance. A silence that wasn't judgment, but something else, like he was holding something back, and if she ever looked too long into his eyes, it might break loose. And yet, he was always the one who carried an extra bucket from the well without being told. The one who left a new bar of soap by the wash basin when hers wore thin. The one who noticed the step icing over and chipped it clean after seeing her slip once near the woodpile. His kindness was never loud. It was steady, quiet, like him. One evening, as May crossed the yard with a bucket of melted snow, her boot hit ice. She went down hard, the water spilling in a bright sheet across the snow. Pain shot up her wrist and knocked the air from her chest. She hissed, biting her lip to keep from crying out. And then arms around her. Strong, fast. Caleb. He had crossed the yard like lightning. You all right? His voice was low, sharp with concern. May blinked up at him. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat. His hands warm even through his gloves as he steadied her shoulders. I'm fine, she managed. He helped her up, one hand on her elbow, the other bracing her back until she stood straight. And then, just as quickly, he let go, stepping back like he'd crossed a line, like her touch had burned. She studied him. He looked away. Thank you, she said softly. He only nodded and turned back toward the barn. That night, as May sat near the stove and cleaned her scraped palm, she thought of the way he had looked at her. Not like a man hungry or cruel, but like someone who recognized her, though he'd never spoken the words. His silence was not the silence of contempt. It was the silence of someone afraid to be known. The change came 3 nights later. It started as a whisper, carried in on Red Callahan's grin. Red was young, restless, always chasing trouble like it owed him something. He'd been to town for supplies, flour, beans, tobacco, and he came back with more in his saddlebag than food. He came back with poison on his tongue. At supper, while the fire crackled and bellies were full, Red leaned back, balancing on the back legs of his chair. He tilted his chin toward the cookhouse door where May was bent over the stove. I've seen her before, he said, casual, cruel. Back in Billings. At the Rosebell. The name dropped heavy, ash settling on hot coals. Everyone knew the Rosebell, a brothel dressed as a saloon. Velvet curtains, cheap whiskey, women who smiled whether they wanted to or not. She wore an apron then, too, Red went on, smiling wide, his teeth yellowed. Always smelled of sage and smoke. Sure, she cooked. But we all know what happens once the whiskey runs low. Cooks don't stay in the kitchen forever. Some of the men chuckled, uneasy. Others laughed outright, sharp and mean. No one asked him to stop. No one told him he was wrong. They just let the words take root. May didn't hear it that night, but she felt it the next morning. The men filed into breakfast slower than usual. They didn't meet her eyes. The usual clatter of tin plates and rough voices was muted. One man coughed, muttered something she couldn't catch. Another sat near the door instead of the long table. They were polite but no longer kind. And May knew. She knew that look. The sidelong glances, the lowered voices, the way men became strangers when they thought they knew a piece of your past. So she kept her head down, stirred the beans, sliced the bacon, poured the coffee. Her hands worked the same rhythm, but her shoulders had gone stiff. Only Caleb lingered at the doorway, his hat brim low, his eyes hard on the men as though he'd heard every word Red had spoken. The smile she sometimes carried, small, fragile, but real, had vanished. Her gaze stayed low, fixed on nothing. At noon, no one sat beside her at the fire. At dusk, no one offered to help with the water buckets. And she said nothing because what could she say? She had worked at Rosebell. She had cooked meals, scrubbed floors, kept her head down. She had not sold herself. But to most men, the distinction didn't matter. They saw what they wanted to see. May had learned long ago that fighting too hard to defend yourself only made you look guiltier. So she endured the whispers, the smirks, the careless cruelty. She had survived worse. But Caleb had heard them, too. He hadn't laughed when Red made his first comment. He hadn't even looked curious. He'd gone still, eyes locked on the fire, as though searching for an answer in the flames. And when Red pushed further that afternoon, throwing another crude line about leftover girls and leftover stew, Caleb moved. It was quick, clean, without warning. No shout, no posturing. Just the hard crack of knuckles against jaw, a sound like thunder in the still air. Red stumbled backward, spit Red into the dirt, shouting, "What the hell's wrong with you?" Caleb didn't answer. He stood above him, fists coiled tight, breath hot and ragged in the cold. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. He never looked at Red, never at the others, not even at May, though she had seen everything from the shadow of the cookhouse door. That night the snow came, soft, steady, falling like ash from a high and endless place. May sat up later than usual, the kitchen quiet except for the low hum of the banked stove. Her hands curled around a chipped mug of tea she'd saved from her wages. She kept thinking of what she had seen. Why had he done it? Why now? And why in silence? She didn't know if it was pity, guilt, or something else entirely. Something she dared not name. The knock came just past 10. Soft, barely there. May opened the door to falling snow, and on the stoop a small basket. Inside, a dozen warm eggs, still faint with heat from the henhouse. A sack of cornmeal wrapped in rough cloth, tied with twine. No note, no name. But she knew. The eggs were Caleb's chore. The cornmeal bore the stamp of the town store, Red's errand, but Caleb had been there, too. She knelt, brushing snow from the basket's rim, her breath rising in pale clouds. The cold did not bite so sharply. She carried it inside, holding it close, and for the first time in days, she let herself smile. Not much, just enough. She didn't understand him, not yet. But maybe she didn't have to. Not tonight. Tonight, someone had remembered her worth quietly, without demand, and that was enough. The fire in the bunkhouse had gone out, but Caleb lay awake, staring into the dark. The wind slipped through the cracks in the wood like whispers he could not silence. Snow drifted outside, weightless and endless, but inside him memory burned like a brand. He could still see her. 3 years ago, Billings. The Rosebell. They had gone there to celebrate. A land deal closed, whiskey burning in their blood, his friends loud and reckless. Caleb had not wanted to go, but he had been young, quieter than he is now, and it had seemed easier to follow than fight. He remembered the smell. Stale bourbon, sweat, heavy perfume. He remembered her, not like the others. No red smile painted on her lips. No sharp laughter. No hunger in her eyes. She wore an apron, her hair pulled into a plain twist. She carried a tray of drinks, weaving through the room with the practiced silence of someone trying not to be noticed. Then she slipped. The tray crashed, liquor spilling across the floor. A merchant, loud, red-faced, puffed up with money and drink, had roared with anger. "You filthy saloon tramp," he spat. "Think dressing like a lady makes you one?" Another man had grabbed the strings of her apron, yanking hard enough to stagger her. Her hands shook, but her eyes, God, her eyes lifted, direct, steady, unflinching. She had met their cruelty with something harder than steel, and Caleb had done nothing. He had stood there at 23, fists clenched, shame choking him silent, old enough to know what was right, too cowardly to act. That shame had never left him. And now here she was again. The same woman who rose before dawn to cook for men who wouldn't meet her gaze, who kept her head down, scrubbed with blistered hands, asked nothing in return. Caleb sat up in his cot, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the cold. He crossed the yard slowly, boots sinking into snow, until he reached the cookhouse. The window glowed faintly. She was still awake, of course. Always mending, fixing, salvaging what others threw away. He set a bundle of firewood on her stoop, dry, clean, the kind that would catch quick. He didn't knock, didn't leave a note. But tonight he didn't walk away either. He lingered in the shadow of a brush thicket near the wall, watching through the faint opening in the curtain. She sat near the stove, bent over her work shirt, stitching the frayed shoulder with steady, careful hands. The light traced her profile, focused, calm, almost reverent in its quiet determination. The world had always tried to break her, and still she met it with dignity. Caleb's chest ached. Shame again, thick and bitter, because in her, he saw everything he had once lacked: courage, pride, the will to survive. He had stood silent once. He would not stand silent again. Inside the cookhouse, May froze. The needle in her hand hovered above the fabric. Her gaze caught in the wavering flame of the lantern. Her shoulders tightened. She remembered him. She remembered Billings. Not just his presence that night, but his silence. Caleb had stood there, watching while laughter and cruelty rang out, while her dignity was stripped and traded like it meant nothing. He hadn't spoken, hadn't lifted a hand. She hadn't hated him for it, not exactly, but the disappointment had cut deep. Because for one foolish, fleeting second she had hoped. Hoped someone might speak for her when her own voice had been drowned out. Yet here, in Stone River, it was Caleb who lifted her water pots without being asked. Caleb who chopped extra wood when the nights froze sharp. Caleb who replaced her soap, who straightened the step when she nearly fell. He never asked for thanks. He never lingered long enough for praise. He gave quietly and left quietly. May's heart beat hard against her ribs. She did not know what to make of him. Maybe she did not want to know. And then came the fire. That night, snow fell thick and fast. A blanket of white pressed over the valley. A wind from the north rattled the eaves. Someone had stacked kindling too close to the back wall of the cookhouse. A single ember, no larger than a pinhead, slipped out from the stove. By the time anyone noticed, flames had already climbed the outer wall, crackling with a hunger that devoured wood and darkness alike. The camp erupted in shouts. Boots thundered against frozen earth. Doors slammed. Men grabbed buckets, shouting orders, cursing at the wind. But May didn't hear them. Exhaustion had claimed her. She slept on the narrow cot near the stove, her body slack with weariness, breath rising and falling against the sound of distant chaos. Caleb didn't hesitate. He broke through the smoke, pulled his coat over her, and lifted her against his chest. The fire lashed at him, biting his arms and cheek with sparks, but he shielded her, his body a barrier against the fury. He stumbled back into the snow as the roof began to groan, refusing to let her go until they were clear. When May woke coughing against his chest, Her eyes fluttered open to find his face inches away. His jaw raw from the heat, his eyes stripped bare of every mask. There was no shame there, no shadow of who she had been or where they had met. Only the present. Only a woman he had once failed, and now refused to fail again. The days turned colder after that. Snow packed over the hills, thick as wool stitched into the land. Each morning, before the bunkhouse stirred, Caleb appeared at the cookhouse. He always mumbled something about firewood or coffee, but May knew better. His gaze lingered on the small kettle at the back of the stove, the one she filled with broth from the night before. Without fail, there was already a cup waiting for him. Without fail, he picked it up, steam curling between them. He never thanked her. She never told him she noticed. It became their truce. May had begun keeping a small ledger hidden beneath the flour sacks. Not for debts or rations, but for memory. In careful script, she copied her mother's recipes. Her handwriting pressed steady where her mother's had once faltered. Cornbread without sugar. Beef stew thick with roots. Molasses pudding that could quiet a roomful of restless men. They weren't just recipes, they were pieces of a dream. A kitchen of her own. A sign that said welcome and meant it. She was bent over onion broth when Caleb came in again, snow dusting his shoulders. "Coffee's hot," she said, her eyes on the pot. He nodded, reached for the tin cup already waiting, and sipped. The silence stretched between them. Then, without looking at him, she asked, "What did you used to think I was?" The cup paused in his hand. He set it down carefully. His voice was low. "I thought you were strong. Even back at the Rose Bell, you didn't flinch." She stilled, the ladle dripping into the broth. "And," he added, quieter still, "I thought I was afraid." "Afraid of me?" she asked, turning to him. His gaze flickered. "Afraid of myself. Afraid that standing there and doing nothing made me no better than the men who laughed." The air between them thickened. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was heavy, laden with history. "I've thought of that night every day since," he said finally. May turned fully now, her eyes steady on his. "Why tell me this now?" "Because," he said, his voice rough, "I owe you more than soup and split wood." She stepped forward, drying her hands against her apron. "Is that what this is? Carry guilt until it turns into redemption?" Caleb flinched, his jaw tight. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I want to be better than I was." She studied him, not the mystery anymore, but the question. And softly, carefully, she asked, "So who are you now?" For a moment he only breathed, his chest rising and falling like he was setting down a burden too heavy to name. Then he spoke. "I am Caleb Stone." May blinked, not at the words themselves, but at the way he said them, like it was the first time he had truly claimed his own name. Stone. That was the name she had heard whispered in passing around the bunkhouse, always with a quiet respect. Stone River Ranch. Caleb hesitated before answering her question, his voice low but steady. "Yes, my father owns it. I was raised here, but I left after the war. When I came back last spring, I asked him not to tell the men who I was. I wanted to work, to build something with my own hands, not live on a name I didn't earn." May's face stilled. The wooden spoon in her hand tapped once against the side of the pot. "All this time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you've been watching me from behind a mask." Caleb shook his head and stepped closer, his eyes carrying more truth than words. "No, I've been trying to earn your truth with mine." But May's heart had known too many masks, too many false promises. She shook her head, retreating as if from a fire that burned too close. "You men," her voice cracked, "you all wear faces, pretend to be better than the last, but you're always watching, always deciding what a woman is worth based on her past." "Not me," Caleb said. Her breath hitched, her walls trembled. "Then why lie?" "I didn't lie," he answered softly. "I just didn't lead with a name. Names never fed a horse, never kept a fire burning. What I've built here, that's the truth I wanted you to see." Silence. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the cold pressed harder against the cabin walls. May turned back to the stove, stirring the soup again, as if her trembling hands needed something solid to hold. Caleb waited. Finally, she ladled a bowl and set it on the table before him. "It's hotter than before," she murmured, "but it cools fast." He sat slowly, lifted the spoon with quiet reverence, and said gently, "So do most things worth waiting for." May said nothing, but she didn't leave, and she didn't turn away. The dawn broke pale and thin, a smear of silver across the Montana ridge. May packed her satchel in silence, her one spare apron, a scarf, her mother's leather-bound cookbook. She left the fire untended, the coals gone cold. Boots crunching on frost, she crossed the yard without looking back. The cookhouse stood still. Even the horses were quiet, as if the whole ranch had paused to watch her leave. She set her bent nail key beside the stove and walked out the door. Her heart didn't ache, it burned. Caleb didn't sleep that night. Snow fell restless and dry, whispering through the eaves. He stood outside the cookhouse, watching the smokeless chimney, the dark windows. He had not stopped her, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew the weight of chains disguised as kind words. Still, the silence hollowed him. Inside, he found the old cookbook she kept near the flour sacks. He opened it, trembling, and tore a blank page from the back. His hand shook as he wrote, "If time could be rewound like a reel of thread, I would be the man who knelt to wipe that floor for you, not the man who watched and turned away. You stood taller than I ever have. You still do. I do not ask you to forgive me, only to know this. When you stepped into my fire, it was the first time I felt warm." He signed his name, simply, humbly, and folded the letter inside the front cover of her cookbook. Then he left it on the table, not expecting she would ever return. But on the third night, in a boarding house on the edge of town, May opened the book. Her fingers found the letter. She read it once, then twice, then held it against her chest as the wind howled against the thin glass panes. The pain was still there, the distrust, the scars, but something softened, a spark small but undeniable. Not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could no longer ignore. Seasons passed. The sun rose gold over the Montana plains, warming the beams of a small building by the old trail. A carved sign swung above the door, May's table. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and smoked pork. The counter held a fresh pie every morning, and behind it always was May, her apron tied with pride, her laughter steady now. She no longer flinched at heavy boots or loud voices. A painted tin sat by the window, marked Dreams, where she taught the local girls to save what little they had for something better. And outside, sleeves rolled, hands deep in soil, was Caleb, tending herbs and tomatoes with the patience of a man who had learned how to begin again. Every Saturday, children crowded the back door. May taught them to knead dough, to laugh when flour dusted their hair, to taste soup and trust their instincts. Sometimes travelers came through, curious. "You cook like you've been doing this all your life," a stranger once said. "Where'd you learn?" May glanced at Caleb, who was slicing onions quietly in the corner, then smiled. "I used to cook for men who never knew my name," she said. "Now, I cook for someone who looks me in the eye." And that was enough. Their wedding was small. The meadow bloomed with wildflowers. The preacher spoke briefly, and May wore a simple cream dress tied with a blue ribbon Caleb had found in an old drawer. When the vows ended, Caleb reached into his coat and drew out a handkerchief. Plain cotton, worn with use. Embroidered in faded red thread was one word: forgiven. He tied it gently around her wrist like a vow that needed no voice. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with something stronger. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No. Thank you for staying when I gave you every reason not to." They turned toward the trail together, sunlight catching the red thread around her wrist. They had no need to run anymore. They had built something fire could not consume. And that was the beginning of everything. He wore his best shirt, pressed as neatly as his hands could manage, and the same quiet smile that had carried him through storms no one else had seen. They stood beneath a crooked oak, its branches bent with age, as two witnesses and a preacher gathered close. The ceremony was brief, the preacher's words plain and almost hurried, as if afraid to disturb the sacred hush that already filled the clearing. But the moment, their moment, lasted longer than any sermon could. When the vows were spoken, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and drew out a handkerchief. Not lace, not silk, just soft cotton worn by years of use. Along one corner, in faded red thread, a single word had been stitched long ago: forgiven. He tied it gently around May's wrist, steady as if he were binding more than cloth. It was a vow that needed no voice, a promise deeper than words. She lifted her gaze to him, eyes bright with a light that had nothing to do with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. His voice was low, certain. "No, thank you, for staying when I gave you every reason not to." Hand in hand, they turned toward the trail, sunlight catching the faded embroidery at her wrist. It glowed like a brand, not of shame, but of survival. They no longer needed to run. Together, they had built something the world could not scorch. Not fire, not shame, not even memory. And in that clearing, beneath the crooked oak, they began everything.